thank you. I would like to thank you very much, Professor Dermot Moran, for having accepted your invitation for this school. And Professor Moran is a professor of philosophy, metaphysical and logic at the University College Dublin. And he is also now president of the International Federation of Philosophical Societies, and he published several books, more precisely about medieval philosophy and contemporary European philosophy, especially phenomenology. I just mentioned the last one is Husserl, Crisis of European Science and Transcendental Phenomenology, an introduction. And today your talk is about defending the transcendental attitude, use of concept of the person, and the challenges of naturalism.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you to Francesca and Roberta for inviting me. And I must say I'm very much enjoying it. I would like to comment on everything that is being talked about, but I can't. I just wanted to say that I did start in medieval philosophy, so I worked a lot in Neoplatonism, which has a very rigorous concept of the self. And so I was thinking yesterday that when you said about Descartes as the first modern person, Augustine has a concept of higher order, willing to will, and so on. There's a lot of these things already in the ancient medieval tradition. But I also work in phenomenology, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. But I'm very happy that there's a project on the person here, because I'm also interested in the concept of the person, which I think is, as Charles Taylor says, part of our moral ontology. But there are lots of questions about where personhood begins and ends. Does it grow or decline? Can it be lost? Is there integrity of persons across lifetimes? Can one become, in late Alzheimer's, for example, a different person, and so on, or no person at all? And these are issues that I think that are really urgent and important. Now, I'm not going to distinguish here between person and self, because the term self or selfhood is often used as identical with personhood. There's a lot of commentary about this, and I could, if I had time, go into it. Part of the problem is that the sources of the concept of person are various, are multiple. There is the notion of persona or prosopon in Greek, which is the idea of a mask, or personare, speaking through a mask, which was the actor's mask in the theater, fixed persona. And then there is, of course, the Trinitarian concept of the person in Latin Christianity, where a person is some kind of an individual substance of a rational nature, as Boethius said. But there's a third source, and we heard it already, of the person, and that is in Alexandrian grammar, where the person is the first person, the second person, the third person. Their categories, person and number, are categories in classical grammar to identify who is speaking. And you know, the concept of person is in all of these. There's, I suppose, a fourth source, which is the notion of persona in Latin law, where a person is someone who is distinct from a slave, someone who is capable of disposing property or owning property or having freedom in certain regard. So all of these different parts of the concept of person, if you like, is a legacy, and our Enlightenment and post-Enlightenment concepts of the person carry many of these notions: autonomy, respect, individuality, rationality, higher order, awareness of oneself, and so on. So, but what I want to do today is just to talk about phenomenology and what it can contribute to the concept of the person. Because I think, perhaps Roberta is very tired of telling this to Lynne, but much of what she says, I think, sounds to me a lot like Husserl, although it's kind of like a reinvented Husserl in a much clearer language. But without the transcendental turn, and that's something that I'm going to try and emphasize today, the importance of taking a non-natural perspective, a step back from the naturalist perspective, which I think Lynne is doing when she talks about quasi-naturalism, but I'm not sure. I think she needs to go all the way and just forget about naturalism. Naturalism, as I was saying earlier on, like the causal closure of physical, is one of these slogans. And please, let me plead with graduate students to give up slogans. Not every concept needs to have the word fine-grained in front of it. You know, there's a language of analytical philosophy. I grew up with it. It drives me mad. And I just think, forget it. You know, just say no to it, as they used to say about the history of philosophy. But since there's so many wrong understandings of phenomenology, I thought I'd begin with that idea. I just read a book by Galen Strawson where he tries to clarify what he means, because it seems that in analytic philosophy now, especially analytic philosophy of mind, phenomenology refers purely to the qualitative character of experience. You know, what it's like to be a bat. But in fact, what I want to say is that it's a description of lived experiences in the broadest sense, in terms not just of the contents and objects of the experience, but also this, if you like, the structuring of the appearance and how it appears to us. But I want to emphasize two aspects that I think are part of what, if you like, the constitution view is within phenomenology. When this is happening to me, this is very annoying when the voice drops. But one is that it's a kind of, in the French postmodernist tradition now, they call this correlationism. Mea Su speaks of correlationism, namely that objectivity is the outcome of the work of constituting subjects, co-constituting subjects. You have to say it in the plural because, you know, even to use John Searle's example, it's not just because I think it's money that it's money, it's because we all together co-constitute it as money in an ordered way, you know, and crediting certain authorities and so on. So objective entities are correlated to acts of subjects. That's the starting point. And then the second point, and this is the bit I think that I really want to emphasize today, is that nature, the concept of nature, which is the basis of naturalism and the basis of the natural sciences, is itself constituted by, if you like, a naturalistic attitude. That correlated to the object has to be understood some kind of stance or attitude, or mindset, what the Germans call Einstellung. And my understanding is that Einstellung came originally from German psychology in the 19th century and was well translated in English by the word set, by mindset, for example. But it got into Bertrand Russell and others as the word attitude, except that in Bertrand Russell and others it just becomes propositional attitudes. You can only have attitudes towards propositions, which is bizarre. You know, like people stand in attitudes of, you know, P or not towards P. You can either say P or not P, or doubt that P, or so on. And I could never get that. But my attitude, if you like, towards the concept of attitude is that we have to think of it as a much more global framework. And I think here, Lynne was saying this yesterday when she said that what she calls the first person point of view is actually a kind of formal structure, if you like, and it doesn't, you know, into which people fit. Davidson has a similar notion, or not Davidson, Davidson commenting on Bertrand Russell makes the same point, that at a certain point in his life, Bertrand Russell thought that, for example, perceptual stances like the one I have now towards this room is just there, it's part of nature. And anyone who stands in here with the appropriate equipment will see as I see. In other words, it's not just a subjective stance, but it is a kind of objectively, in one sense of objectively, it's really part of our experience of the world. So the attitude and what's correlated with it, the set of objects revealed by the attitude, they have to be thought together in some respect. Now, one of the things that Husserl will say is that nature is correlated with the naturalistic attitude. And by naturalistic attitude, you mean the attitude of the mathematical natural sciences. They're the people who tell you what quarks are and so on, and whether atoms are part of our conceptual framework or whether they are part of the empirically given. These are issues in the philosophy of science, but it's all within the naturalistic attitude. But for Husserl, and he makes this point repeatedly, and it's really evident in what we just heard before with regard to children and babies. The personalistic attitude is prior to the naturalistic or the natural attitude. We have to be careful a little bit with those terms. But the personalistic attitude is the one in which we say I or you but also it's the one in which we recognize each other. This concept of social recognition is really important. Of course, it has a long history in Hegelian philosophy and German idealism, but the idea is that there's a certain stance under which persons are seen as such. That's something that we probably can't get away from. And of course, it's at the basis of modern law, or even Kant. The idea that persons are to be treated as ends in themselves, and not just means. That's a stance taking towards persons. Okay. This is the emphasis that I want to give, that phenomenology is by its essence transcendental. And that means that it has the character of stepping back from our world and seeing world as some kind of constituted accomplishment. There's a quote from Husserl, and that kind of, again, medieval background gives me a kind of respect for text, but conscious life is through and through intentionally accomplishing life. Intentional leistendes Leben. Husserl uses the word Leistung a lot, achievement or outcome, that through which the life world, with all its changing representational contents, in part attains anew and in part has already attained its meaning and validity. Sein und Gelten. All real mundane objectivity is the constituted accomplishment in this sense, including that of men and animals, and thus also of souls. This would be a difference from Lynne. Lynne thinks that animals don't constitute the world. Or at least you said that in your paper yesterday. They constitute nothing, was your phrase. And I would challenge that. I mean, they constitute the life world of animals, the habitat, Umwelt of an animal, the Umgebung, as Husserl would call it, of an animal, is a very complex constituted accomplishment. In many ways, similar to our own, but perhaps with less reflexivity and so on. I wouldn't draw the line solely with language use, but anyway, that's a comment. But let me say what the personalistic attitude, again, I'm giving you a text from Husserl. The personalistic attitude is, in a way,
ma non è meglio che usa il gelato, però, scusate.
The attitude we always are. This is, as I said, the challenge to naturalism. Not everything is explained by science. The attitude we are always in when we are with one another, talk to one another, shake one another's hands in greeting, or related to one another in love and aversion, in disposition and action, in discourse and discussion. I think that's a good overall view. This is what Lynne would talk about as a robust sense of personal recognition. It has to be built on something else. But just to jump ahead, because I'm not going to have the time to give you, if you like, the Husserlian account of the person in detail, but I'm just summarizing here what I take to be some of the main points. That persons are, if you like, sense makers, and this is the idea. I like to emphasize this because this is if you like, pre-propositional. There's a sense in which even babies make sense of the world. They can close their mouth against food, or they can grab something. They can show an interest and have interest prior to language, and indeed have a sense of already the difference, we heard it today, between I and not I. And this is very deep. But of course, in the very complex situations, human beings are sense makers in very, very complex places. As John Searle says, you know, to have anxiety about post-depression capitalism is a very complex kind of anxiety that is only explicable in linguistic terms and relations to all kinds of social structures. The persons, we have missed this. Persons have a relationship to history, and that is to their own past and future. And this is something that I think phenomenology puts a very strong emphasis on. It's taken up by the narrative account of the self that you find in Charles Taylor and others. But part of our meaning making is that we are endowing our past and futures with a meaning, rather selectively, of course, but we are picking the bits that we want to say, that's me. So I can say things beautifully like, I wasn't myself yesterday. I mean, just think of that from the point of view of self-identity. I wasn't myself yesterday. That wasn't me talking. That's not the real me. I mean, the fact that we're doing that shows that we are able, if you like, to select from the stream of our conscious awareness things that we think are us, and things that are not us. But aside from that, and this is the point Husserl makes, we are creatures or beings of habit. We have a habitual self. The ego of habits, Husserl calls it. So in a way, nothing is ever lost. So we are, if you like snowballs. When we roll down the hill, we collect everything. So if you were a Labour supporter, and then you stop being a Labour supporter, you are still a person who used to be a Labour supporter and no longer is. So, you know, nothing, things get crossed out, but they're still in your history. Unlike, you know, like Google. It's just there. You know, it'll just always be there. So the scar, this is true of your body, but also of your emotions and your development. And of course, this affects your attitude. So it's this dynamic, developmental, evolving character of the self that is really, I think, the temporal character. Husserl, William James, they were very interested in that temporal flow character. That's very important. Of course, the agency aspect we've heard about. I think that we all want to now reject a completely atomistic account of the self, of the pure, if you like, Cartesian self existing on its own. The ego on its own was the title of a book by Max Stirner in the 19th century. And really, there is no, as everyone, even Shaler says, there is no Robinson Crusoe in the pure sense. There's no completely individual entity. All entities are social and intersubjective. As Husserl says, the development of a person is determined by the influence of others. So Husserl's account of the person, and it's very rich, and I would argue that it's, well, I suppose the reason I'm here at this conference is that I'm supposed to say there's this other side of the tradition that it's worth digging into, because it's, I would say, that Husserl has the most complex account of the person in the 20th century, the most many-sided aspect of consciousness. It's in dense and difficult language, but there is still a lot of matter there that's worth mining for thinking about the future. But what he talks about in the human body is the human person, with his or her spiritual individuality, geistige, is, you know, mental or spiritual individuality, intellectual and practical abilities, character and sensibility. This ego is certainly apprehended as dependent on its body, and therefore on the rest of physical nature. But likewise, it is dependent on its past. It's that second part that I think that is missing in a lot of the naturalistic accounts of the self that we get. This position taking has the character, again, Husserl recognizes it, that the self-reflective aspect, the formal self-reflection, if you like, is a higher level capacity. The capacity therein of reflectively taking positions vis-a-vis oneself and one's life. That is the capacity for personal acts. If acts are to be truly personal, they have to be, if you like, owned by you. You take a stance in terms of self-knowledge, self-evaluation, practical self-determination, self-willing, and self-formation. So, you know, not just Frankfurt, but earlier on, there's a lot of recognition that higher order acts, second order acts, as people say, but you have to say higher because you can have order acts over above your ordered acts. Your first or second, third, you can have many acts on top of each other. These are something that are part of the, you know, making of your personhood. For example, as I said, the fact that you decide, I'm no longer going to vote this particular party, becomes a part of you. It's something that is now you. You are the person who is thus and so decided, as they say. And that's something that you already find Husserl commenting on at great detail, because it takes place not just at the level of thoughts and decisions, but much lower down at the levels of drives and instincts. Husserl talks about the drive to smoke. And he says you can have this, and all of these do show up in consciousness. You can have the conscious urge to smoke, but you can also have an attitude towards your desire to smoke. You can have, you know, you wish you didn't have the desire to smoke, or you wish you could curb your desire to smoke, and so on. So you can have attitudes towards your attitudes. And these are already embedded, if you like, in our manner of acting. We don't maybe want to fully endorse we don't want to give in to the desire to smoke, you know. And for Husserl, as for Aristotle, once you take a decision, it becomes something that is, if you like, the beginning of a habit. So already you have a turning around. Once you even recognize that you have a desire to smoke, it can be the beginning of a changing of that desire or whatever. These are just quotes from Husserl at various points talking about the self as a subject of a substrate of habituality.
I think it's better to change the mind.
Yes. I could want to try. Okay, try that. Yeah, this is working now, but probably will have the same effect. Husserl talks about this idea of the I center, and for Husserl, actually I think this is true for Lynne also, that human consciousness, actually for Husserl, all consciousness has to be ego-centered. The idea of a non-ego-centered consciousness seemed to him an eidetic impossibility. It's just, you couldn't have just a consciousness that was also not an ego consciousness, because in a way this is a bit like this pre-reflective point. There has to be a center from which the conscious stream is radiating and towards which it is being passively affected. But beyond that, you have this notion of what Husserl talks about as substrate of habituality. And the idea of the self as somehow governing or holding sway in a vast domain of experiences. Not just, we talked about embodied experiences, and of course there's a sense of holding sway or governing, this idea that of control over your body. How far can you reach, when you're driving a car that expands a bit, so how you think your whole car can enter through a gap. These are concepts of, if you like, beginning what is now called proprioception, but there's a broader sense of what it is that you are, if you like, governing over. What it is that you are reigning over. If you're paddling a canoe, you are reigning over the whole canoe. So, our consciousness has to have that character of expanding over an area or not, or being default, getting into, getting corrupted so that we think part of ourselves is not part of ourselves and so on. All of these stem from this prior concept of having a kind of sense of not just ownership, but control. And that is a part of voluntary action, if you like. So that there are many things that seem involuntary, and yet they have a they can be affected voluntarily, breathing, and so on. So, but this goes all the way up and down. Now, I emphasize that notion of history. So basically, what I've been emphasizing is this overall contribution of what I take to be the phenomenological tradition. I mean, really, Husserl, Scheler, Merleau-Ponty here, in terms of the modes of givenness, under which things are experienced in relation to some kind of an attitude, the intrinsic intentionality of the experience, the agency, and then what I mentioned here, which is now becoming something that's being developed a lot in the cognitive science tradition, this notion of narrativity. We don't want to go too far with the notion of narrativity and think of it as in the Sartrean way, as a kind of you are the author of yourself in a completely free way, as if you were writing your own story. But even Dermot has a version of this with the multiple drafts. There is a sense in which we are experiencing our lives already as part of a narration. For some people, every day is a disappointment. For others, the glass is always half full or whatever. This is a way of experiencing your life, and it is individualized. Now, there's a lot of ways in which, and this is where literature explores this, that can be affected in many ways. But we have to understand that narrativity is, if to use that phrase, is already built into the character of our experiencing. So, Husserl wants to very much reject the view of the ego as an inner box, as he says, containing experiences, or a slate of consciousness upon which things light up and disappear again, or a bundle, right? Rather, that there's a sense of fluctuation, but there's an ego center, there's a pole. to which things are manifest and to which they return. A radiating outwards in the case of willfulness or assertion, or just absorption, you know, in just passively experiencing. That's also a part of the ego function. And that's something that actually in the phenomenological tradition is very well described. The difference, I mean, you find this in Heidegger, between experiencing things in a uniquely, if you like, self-active way, or just running along as everyone does, the Das Man character, you know, we're just doing it the way everybody does. And much of our experience has a kind of neutral Das Man character to it, a merely neutral I as any other, you know. You're on the train, you're the same as every other passenger, there's nothing unique except your dreams, if you like. But that passively experiencing, publicly available flow of your, if you like, neutral consciousness is you. I mean, the point made by the phenomenologist is that you couldn't have authenticity without this Das Man inauthenticity. That if you didn't have this one character of your experience, this everyone character of your experience, you couldn't have the individuality. So it's not, if you like, sharp, self-possessive individuality all the way down. It's an individuality, as Wittgenstein might have said, floating on a sea of a much broader sense of not quite anonymous, but of an everyday character of self. So some of these things, I have a slide later on, I'm sure I won't get to it, where Edith Stein says that the self sinks its taproot into nature. And I think this is something that the phenomenologists recognize, that as embodied beings, we have layers that go way deep down. So, you know, there are drives and instincts at the very bottom. And on that are all the sedimentations, as Husserl calls them, which is, if you like, the encrusted habits and experiences that, if you like, just, you know, like barnacles, collect themselves around our world. And then above that, then we have the higher level stances and convictions. You know, beliefs turn into convictions, and then have a character that you don't have to access them rationally each time. So this is something that was being talked about earlier, that you know, you don't have to run through the discovery process to think that 6 + 6 is equal to 12. And once we've learned it, it just becomes something. So we can just see it or read it off. But you could lose that and have to do it again. So these sedimentations have a complex character. And of course, you know, Freudian psychoanalysis has that interest in sort of what happens when things that have sedimented pop up again, you know, when they are when there are traces or reverberations from things that have happened earlier that are disturbances now at the conscious level, and how are they to be recognized. So there is a kind of, I don't want to say naturalism, but I want to say a recognition of the in the world and the embodied character of experience. So the self has to have, we have to recognize in the self all these things, instincts, drives, subpersonal embodied experiences. But the point is, as to use Lynne's name, at the robust level, you know, the robust person, if you like, the full person, has ownership nearly all the way down. The tightrope walker has perfect balance. Most of us don't. So we haven't tried to capture that notion of balance, which we're doing. I mean, and balance has a conscious element to it. I couldn't do this if I was asleep. Standing upright is something that requires consciousness, self-awareness and consciousness of quite a high degree. So, you know, but you can train it even further. So a tightrope walker develops it to a very fine degree. It integrated into their self. They became the person who can absorb this level or balance themselves in this particular way. And I, you know, once you start thinking of the self in this more, if you like, rounded character, I think it gives you a much fuller picture. And I think that one of the points that I think recent contemporary philosophy of mind, especially cognitive science, recognized that. They used to just talk about brains and brains in vats, and, you know, then it became brain in the spinal column, and then it became you know, the brain and the perceptual system. Eventually you have to have the whole lot. You know, the endocrine system and the whole village, as Hillary Clinton would say, it takes a village to raise a child, you know this. You need the whole village to make a person, you know, so that and this is the point, that starting from the upper world, the intentional world is so rich that it includes the other levels, but as parts of it. So think of food functions like eating, you know, or sleeping. These are natural functions in one sense, but think of the way they're culturally constituted. So there's Indian food and Chinese food and all the rest of that, or food habits. So, you know, you can't think of something as merely natural. Nothing is merely natural. And I think this is what I'm sort of complaining about in this way in which a certain kind of philosophy of mind just adopted naturalism. And I would have to go forward to take up some of the quotes I have towards the end. I'll do that now in a minute. But it seems that almost every philosopher of mind, Galen Strawson does it, you know, Searle does it, all of these people who want to have some kind of rich description of the intentional character of experience, Dennett does it, they all end up, or they all start, if you like, with the, you know, it's like the Russia, you know, you have to have your communist Russia. You have to be a card-carrying member of the Communist Party. You have to be a card-carrying naturalist before you say anything. You know, Patricia Churchland, Paul Churchland, you just have to start with this naturalist assumption. But the naturalist assumption is not naturalism in the loose sense of understanding, you know, the full content of experience and the manner of experiencing that I've been describing. It's a very narrow definition. So it's one that assumes, as we heard yesterday, that only the entities in physics are real, perhaps, or only physics is authorized to describe this awful phrase, the furniture of the world, you know, which itself, of course, is a misnomer. Because if you think of physics, it doesn't have furniture, and physics doesn't have, you know, Bertrand Russell. I studied physics, and then I always remember reading Bertrand Russell's basic problem, what's it called, The Problems of Philosophy. And he starts talking about the two tables, the one that we see and touch, and then the physicist's account of the table, which is mostly empty space and electrons and force fields and so on. But of course there's no tables in physics. They're parts of the life world, of the everyday world. They're not parts of physics. Physics might have, I don't think it would ever get so specific enough to be able to slice a bit of the space-time continuum down to what is being occupied by the table right now. You know, it's just not part of it. They don't have that level of description. So you can't then have reducibility in the way in which they try to do it, because you're talking about really what I would regard as different orders of description. They're not completely incommensurate. This is, I think, a mistake also that will end up in a kind of relativist picture. If you take the view, as Husserl does, that if you like, the full, rich attitude is what he calls the personalistic, or let's say the interpersonalistic attitude. And then abstracted from that, you have something like the natural attitude, which takes things in a more sort of concrete, you know, way. And then you can have the economist attitude, if you like, that everything is the result of decisions or whatever. I mean, you can have different specifications, but the naturalistic one is a further sub-specification that just drops out everything else until you get down to the space-time continuum and the basic elements of the four fundamental causes in nature or whatever. And they're these four fundamental forces. And they're the kinds of things that when you already agree to do that, you can say, yes, that is an integral part of our life world. There is the life world of people. And some of them are scientists who specifically and for very specific reasons adopt this very specific framework. Now, I'm going to jump on. I had a lot of things to say. I'll come back to it. I had said this about persons. Sorry, I had a lot of stuff in here. I was complaining about various people, including I have stuff on Lynne, but she said it. Some of the things. This is something I wanted to pick up. Now, when I'm saying that I'm trying to get this across, that there's this these stances or attitudes, and you know, Dennett has it, except Dennett thinks that the intentional stance is merely heuristic. It does think it's quicker. So you look at the cat and the mouse and you say the cat wants to eat the mouse and the mouse doesn't want to be eaten, so the mouse will run away, and it's predictive. But Dennett's real view is that, as he puts it, if you were a Laplacian determinist, you'd be able to work it all out by molecules and atoms and laws of prediction regarding the physical world. But it just would take so long to do that, it's quicker to say the mouse doesn't want to be eaten. So we attribute intentional thoughts and stances to the mouse and to the cat, but we do so from, if you like, a third-person perspective. We're not, for Dennett, obliged to think of these as really internally happening inside the minds of the mouse and the cat. They're just a way of describing. It's a shorthand for describing something that physics could also describe ideally. This is Dennett's view. He has various versions of this, but I think this is his ground floor version, if you like. That's not what a stance or an attitude is for the phenomenological tradition, because first of all, someone must occupy a stance. I mean, what Dennett leaves out is that the person attributing the intentional stance must itself hold the intentional stance. Dennett's answer is, oh, it's just come there with an evolution, so human beings, and he thinks dogs, are able to apply the intentional stance to themselves. I wrote a paper on this once called All the Lights Are On and Nobody's Home. And that's the Dennett view of the self, if you like. There's nobody home, but you know, but that person is able, that non-person, that nobody is able to look through the grid of the intentional stance and make predictions and see things in the world and look at themselves as persons. But you know, that's like it's a neutral operating system sitting out there that we can make avail, that we can just avail of. Whereas the whole point that I've been stressing is that if you think of consciousness as egoic, if you like, all the way down, that there is a kind of I-centeredness, and that the intentional stance is one that is, if you like, inhabited by me. That's the first point. It may be something that I primarily apply to others in the I-thou relationship, if you like, in the recognition of others' attitudinal stances. But it's something that is attributable to others in part because it is owned and operated by me. The idea that it could be just some kind of thing that was thrown up by nature, if you like, seems bizarre to me. And that's what I would think about this notion of a stance. But the second thing about, and this brings us to what was being discussed yesterday actually in relation to Bernard Williams and the absolute stance towards the world, is one of the features of human beings that not only do we occupy and inhabit and live and grow in a personalistic stance, but, I mean, then Husserl has a story about how this happened in Western Greek thought, that there was a breakthrough to a kind of theoretical perspective that allows us to take, if you like, the disengaged spectator stance towards our experience. And that's a very specific unplugging of aspects of the intentional stance. But it's done for a very particular character. You know, it's in order to get what you might say is the view from nowhere. But, you know, like, but it's done by a number of steps. If I want to know what it's like for you to look out that window that I can't see now, I have to begin by imagining myself over there where you are, and so on. So there's a number of ways that I have to build from my position here to your position there, to anyone's position anywhere, if you like, or position nowhere. And that is a very highly developed and sophisticated utilization and development of the intentional stance that takes place in modern scientific culture. So Charles Taylor says it very well. Our humanity also consists, however, in our ability to decenter ourselves from this original engaged mode that I've been describing, to learn to see things in a disengaged fashion, in universal terms, or from an alien point of view, to achieve at least notionally a view from nowhere. Only, and this is his qualification, we have to see that this disengaged mode is in an important sense derivative. It's derivative on the engaged mode. And this is something that reverses the scientific account, that wants to think that the purely objectivist description from nowhere, the God's eye perspective, whatever way you want to describe it, is primary, and that what has to be negated is, if you like, our personal plugged-in perspective. Whereas it's precisely the other way around, that the plugged-in perspective is the only one that gives us persons as persons, that gives us social acts, that recognizes things like handshakes as greetings, and so on. And then there is a very sophisticated, developed, and multi-layered, forms of disengagement, bracketing of one thing or another, that goes on, that gives us access and discloses new features of the world. But as Husserl pointed out, the big problem was when we really invested everything in this objectivist view of the world, and thought that the other one was always merely subjective. I wanted to say more. That's my Edith Stein quote, who was very interesting on this. But I'll stop. What I've been trying to say is that, and I'll just finish with the last sentence, that the phenomenological account is very rich, but some people want to just raid it without recognizing that it has a kind of anti-naturalist starting point, which you might say is a transcendental position. The transcendental position being that objects reveal themselves from the standpoint of attitudes. And that when you're talking about an object, you should really think, what attitude am I looking at this under? So there's an aesthetic attitude that sees things in terms of value of works of art. There's a religious attitude that will see the same thing as a religious icon. And it's not to say that, in certain cases, one will have a trump the other, depending on what's going on. But there are some cases where things don't trump the other. I gave you to just find that, this is part of my sort of non-naturalist approach. There are different accounts and there are different conceptions of truth at work. So when you go to a court case and there's different narratives, the part of the decision of the court case, let's say there's a jury, will be how they read the narratives. What happened in the accident, who was here, who was where. You can't go back and replay it. There's no objective fact that we can now access independently of everything else. There's a bunch of stories. Embedded in jeweled, encrusted with facts, if you like. But we have to decide which is the more credible. Now that notion of a kind of consensus and coming of agreement is a kind of truth. It's the truth that we recognize in the jury system. Now it's different, not entirely, from intersubjective validity and peer refereeing and all the rest of it in the sciences, but we have to recognize that's a completely different form of understanding of truth than merely comparison to some world out there which holds independently of our beliefs about it. So I just wanted to give you, if you like, a different picture from which we can have the same discussions about about persons and their, if you like, robust character, but which has, if you like, a more complex envelope around it. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Questions?
Maybe Dermot will use this one. I don't know your name.
Thank you very much, Professor Moran, for this presentation. I would like to ask something pertaining to differentiating within the phenomenological perspective. So, for instance, Shaler in the Formalism book says that the person, is atemporal, it acts into time, whereas for Husserl, it's about a tendency or habit of position taking, which therefore refers to the passivity of intentionality, which therefore refers to time consciousness. And then for South, South will say at the end of Being and Nothingness, where he's dealing with psychoanalysis, that the past doesn't matter, rather it's the projects for the future that matters. So I would like to ask you basically what sort of position you would prefer to present as a more robust or viable phenomenological tradition of the person.
I suppose I don't want to get drawn into saying that there's a unique way we ought to validate the past. It depends on what you're doing. For historians, it has a certain kind. if you're finishing a marriage, it has a different character. You know, you just want to forget, or maybe, you know, this business will move on and so on. You know, Americans are very future-oriented. You know, Bill Clinton came to Northern Ireland to try to help solve the peace process, and one of the things he said, "You guys are talking about what happened in 1640." You know, and that's a problem. But because some people carry their history with them, like snails carry the shells, you know, and that's different ways of inhabiting personhood. I don't want to make a decision about that. Sartre is recommending, you know, in sort of Buddhist thing, you know, one step, one encounter, every start is new. You know, today is the first day of the rest of your life. That's kind of Sartrean existentialism. I never was here before. It doesn't matter what I did yesterday or what my gender was yesterday. Today I make the decision. And again, you know, that's future-oriented. But that's, they're, if you like, kind of, they're all of the decisions that are taken at a kind of position further on from the basic notion that I have, that part of being a self is to have an evaluative relationship to past and future occurrences, and to see yourself as oriented in both directions. Jane is headed. That's the phenomenological insight. The Shaler point, there's one side of Shaler that I really like, which he says that he thinks uniquely persons are oriented towards values. So, you know, they're value recognizing and value taking beings. So, of course, truth is a value. But, you know, that's one value. But, you know, goodness is a value and so on. And that brings you outside of the naturalistic framework, you know, I think already. So so I don't want to make a decision within phenomenology about the different viewpoints. I'm sort of trying to put together a kind of composite picture at the moment.
Thank you.
So thank you very much for this very rich presentation. Just a suggestion, I mean, maybe a question. Aren't you going too much in the transcendental direction? I try to explain myself. You said, I mean, the main point is to consider that objects reveal themselves from the point of view of attitudes, and I quite agree. The point is, how are we to understand this proposition? In a purely epistemological way or in an ontological one? Or I mean, well, to be clear, once you are in a personalistic attitude and you do understand that it's part of you, of what you can do within a modern scientific culture to sort of gain this kind of view from nowhere and so on and so on. Then the point is, how is the knowledge you gain within this view from nowhere related to the ordinary knowledge? That's the point. I mean, my suggestion was, wouldn't there be within Husserl an intellectual, a conceptual tool quite similar to Baker's constitution theory, namely in the terms of the notion of Fundierung?
Yes.
Fundierung. In that sense, because otherwise the problem is that you'd be a neo-Kantian. This is my problem. I mean, you would just reduce everything to epistemology without taking care of ontology. I mean, the suspect was, I mean, my problem was when you talked about different sort of truth, and particularly the truth in a justice code. I do think that, in fact, it's a matter of verification, maybe. It's a matter of whatever can be accepted as a basis for a sentence, a justice court sentence, but not a matter of reducing facts to that perspective. I do think that you must hold a verification transcendental concept of truth in order to have this kind of ontological foundation. If you are not, if you have no ontological foundation at all, you are just a neo-Kantian, not a phenomenologist. Okay, I don't know if I'm...
No, I understand the question. One of the things is that, let's start with what is called the correlationist position, that the objects reveal themselves through specific attitudes. That really means that there is what Husserl would call a regional ontology related to the attitude. So there are museums full of artworks. So the ontology of artworks is very complicated. But if you are using the painting for firewood, you know, it's just ontologically, it is a piece of wood, you know, or canvas or burnable material. So the problem is that we have since the 17th century attributed a certain priority to the physicalist or materialist account of what things are, as what they really are. So this question, when you say the neo-Kantian, when you think perhaps, and I'd be worried about this, that there's a kind of ontology outside of all the regional ontologies, which is the ontology to beat all ontologies. And I don't think there is. I think there is. I like the Husserlian distinction of what he calls formal ontology, which is the characteristic of anything whatsoever. It's almost kind of like the objects that logic deals with. And then the material objects, the material ontologies, which are just going to be different. Now, I'm not a relativist. I don't think they're just different ontologies like aesthetics, personalistic, economic. There is a lot of that going on in the science, especially the human sciences, where there are different categorical frameworks at work. There has to be some way of translating them. And indeed, this is the point that Husserl makes in The Crisis, that the scientific one has run away, but the life world one, if you like, the one we live in, we can't relate it to it. But there must be some way of relating it. Relating it to doesn't mean reducible. It's not, you know, like, I'll give you the example. Truth is a good point, but I don't want to, truth is too complicated. But let's take time, which is less complicated, it's just as complicated. But, you know, there is a conception of time in physics, you know, and you can have t squared, so you can have time that's squared. And then the awkward point is that there's minus or plus t can be filled into that square. So, you know, time can run backwards, if you like, at least in physics. That's no problem, at least in the equations. And we operate with this purely formal conception. And then we have our everyday sense of time, or the biological sense of time, where it goes only in one direction, or historical sense of time, or whatever. And Husserl's point is, if we're going to call this thing t, time, then we have to have some way of relating it to our everyday conception of time. Otherwise, just call it, you know, quine, or some other thing that doesn't, it's not time, right? And then we have no way of intuitively fitting it. And this is a real problem, you know, and so I think that we have to be a little bit careful here that when we talk about, I think we abandon the myth of a final ontology, but we also have to recognize the priority of the life world or personal world, everyday world, you know, because worlds like space and time won't mean anything if we don't have what we do by it, mean by it. Sorry, yes, Roberta.
Just one more, maybe, very, very let's
put it this way. The foundation relation in Husserl says, well, a thing A is founded on a thing B if A couldn't possibly exist without B, but of course it's not reducible to B. Now the point is, if this relation works, then you can have kind of priority of the A of the founded things, because it's, as Lynne says, science tells us what else there is, but reality is already there. So in which case B or the founding things, the constituting thing in terms of Lynne, would just be, so to speak, the basis, as I said, and not you couldn't do without it, okay? And that's the point. If this is true, then you have to somehow have a unified vision of reality, because you must, so to speak, give some flesh to the Fundian position. And that's why, I mean, sorry, I was too long.
No, I understand. Okay. I could talk about that later.
Dermot, I really enjoyed the paper. I think I agree with almost everything you said, probably everything that makes it very good from my point of view.
Except the fact that I said it and not you.
But I thought it. So I agree that Husserl may well be the most important philosopher of the 20th century for thinking about persons. I agree that the concept of person cannot be grasped or conceptualized from the naturalistic point of view. I agree that there is nothing that is merely natural, and even I agree, and that's a strong point for you, that the disengaged perspective is derivative. Even actually Sellars granted that. But still, I think the challenges of naturalists that you mentioned in your title are still there, the serious ones. Not the crazy scientific view that everything was it, but the serious ones. Take another transcendental philosopher, take Kant, the third antinomy. You would, if you live now, probably would agree with what you said, but then it would come and say, but there is the other perspective. In some sense, it's generated from, the agential personal perspective, but it's still there. So if I have to understand Michele, what Michele will do in the next hour, I can think about what he will do, I can explain him by considering his reasons, but I can also have, he would say, a scientific explanation of his behavior, his movements, and they go together. So how can I reconcile these two views? I cannot simply say that one is generated from the other, because one generated. The scientific view is there, is powerful in explaining the things. So how, I'm asking you, also you had a 30 more slides, probably you talk about this.
Well, two things. I mean, the Kant's notion of person is, and he has a strong notion of person, especially in the anthropology lectures and in the moral philosophy. He recognizes persons as belonging to this kingdom, if you like, of ends, and so he has a two-world theory in a way, that they are beings embedded in nature, and so far as they're in nature, they are obeying natural laws. But what is really important about them is to do with them being beings capable of giving the law to themselves and having freedom and all of that. So his account is, if you like, a two-world theory of persons. We heard this, yes, you had a version of this yesterday, and I think there's something, he captures something right, but that the problem is that there's no connection between. And I think that we need a story for integrating these relationships of different perspectives. And what has happened is that the disengaged scientific perspective has such extraordinary power that it has, if you like, overtaken all the other perspectives, well, up to a point. And then, I would imagine, this is one of the things that the phenomenologists think about, that this sort of, if you even take Heidegger, framework, this kind of technological framework of thinking, this scientific technological framework within which everything is possible, it just takes over everything. Okay. So that I was having this discussion in China when they were giving the example of, say, Chinese medicine, which is based on different principles than Western medicine. So it's based on things like energy fields and qi and points of blockage of energy and so on. And within that, they explain acupuncture that way. Now it turns out, let's suppose that acupuncture works. There's a lot of evidence that it does work. But when you talk about evidence that it does work, the Western medics want Western evidence. In other words, they don't want to hear about qi and force fields and all that. They want to have it re-explained within their own terminology. And that's the power of the scientific. It's kind of like the one world view. There's only one way, there's only one, well, I hope there's only one kind of map for how airplanes fly across the the world. You know, there isn't two of them. People say we drive on the other side. You know, you can't have that. So there's the universality and dominance of the disengaged perspective is something that is, you know, to be respected, and but at the same time it has to be challenged, because otherwise it's exactly as Husserl says in The Crisis, that you lose the human perspective. But the challenge is to have this translation. But the translation, as I keep saying, can't be a reduction of one to the other. That's my short answer.
Yeah. Can you hear me? That doesn't work.
Okay. It's just a follow-up of Mario's question, but it seems to me that the challenges of naturalism to the position you presented and the position which I try to defend in my talk are much stronger than the mention you made of ego punch-up, because the strong naturalist may say, look, person is a forensic notion. It's something which has nothing to do with the real going on of our mind. And here I have a huge amount of empirical research about confabulations, about blindside, neglect, about and so. So I think that the challenge should be taken in looking at the detail of the reductionist approaches, not just saying there are two words that is so hard to put in communication, because if we don't take this attitude, probably science will win the battle, because they are so confident. And you mentioned Bertrand Russell about the physician's table. In a sense, there is a physician's table because physicist table. There is a physicist table because a table is a mass, for example, and mass should be counted when you have to move the table and so on. So there are continuously aspect of our study of the world in which the two levels interact. So this is, according to me, the most difficult problem.
Yeah. No, I of course recognize the problem, and I recognize it's not easy. But I think that philosophers these days see too much to the physicalist description. I mean, when you talk about things like confabulation and blindsight, as if, oh look, we trick ourselves. There really isn't us at all. This is all trickery, and it's not that. This is the way we are. Yes, we are. Lying, cheating, stealing people who make up things about ourselves. Look at anyone's CV. This is who we are. And the point is that this goes all the way down. There isn't. It's like the onion. In a way, it's like the onion. That the onion is made up of all the layers. It's not that there's a core at the bottom. There's a core in a different sense, in that there has to be self-identity, that we have to identify across the layers, if you like, that they are each us, and that's very, very complicated. And there's a certain truth in the Kantian notion that there must be some kind of I consciousness in everything else. I mean, it's just a simple, you could imagine this thought experiment as to why you couldn't be a Humean and think there's no self. I mean, if you had something like a radio that picked up everybody's inner thoughts, so you could just move the dial and you say the different people, how would you know which one was your own in this room, right? You just pick up thoughts, and in a way I think the schizophrenic has that problem. Some of their own thoughts, they stop self-identifying them, and they start hearing them as voices of somebody else, right? Or whatever. But they confabulate like that. But you see what I mean? There isn't a brain answer to that. That answer is taking place on another level, and that's I suppose my way of talking about it. That we need an I concept and a personal concept, but it needs to be integrated with the scientific account, not just seen as being faulty.
Last question, very good.
Okay, thanks for your presentation. My question is this: how to build up a scientific psychology based on a first-person perspective. I mean, should psychology reduce to the aim of generalization and so on, and focus on individuality?
No, it's not a matter of one or the other. My brother is a professor of psychology in the same university I'm in, and so I live with constant psychological discussion. But psychologists are very careful in what they say. I mean, their own methodology is much narrower. In other words, that the permission they allow themselves to interpret their own results is narrower than I would say the permission that the philosopher gives themselves to interpret the same results. So one of the problems with psychology is the psychologists like to keep it nice and tight and close. So, you know, and they're right, because they recognize the limits of the methodology. But in a way, for philosophers, they're like intuition pumps, so we use them to do whatever we like. But the point is that the way in which scientific psychology is going, it's so tiny and incremental. It's not making general laws. It's making very tiny precisions of other very tiny kind of, you know, stuff. With the assumption you'll build this huge picture. But, you know, operating within it are all kinds of assumptions that I think you'll find, you know, one of the points Husserl makes, and I think you could still make it, is that the whole challenge of psychology as to whether it is a science at all is a challenge that's built into its foundation, and it's probably going to continue. Hence, a lot of departments change their title to cognitive science or something else, behavioral science. This is happening all over the place. Because they're worried that the very ground principles are not clear.
Okay, thank you, Dermot, again.